Okay, so in this video, we're going to talk about the Holocaust and the concept of ethnic cleansing. So, just to get a definition out of the way, the Holocaust was the systematic arrest, deportation, and eventual mass murder of people the Nazis deemed to be undesirable. For the Nazis, there were three different groups of enemies that, in the mind of the Nazis, made Germany weak. So the first type of enemy are blood enemies, and here we would find the Jews, Africans, the Roma people. Simply by existing in Germany, they made Germany weak. The next group of people are political enemies. These are people that had political opinions or political views that were different than the Nazis. So here you might find Democrats, meaning people who believe in democracy, and socialists or communists. And then finally, you have moral enemies, and these are people who did things that the Nazis did not approve of for moral reasons. The principal group here would be homosexuals, but also criminals in general fell into this group. We might also put into the blood enemies group people who were disabled mentally or physically. They would also fall into the blood enemies group. So for the blood enemies, they had to be removed, either deported or eventually killed. The other enemies could be re-educated. And so many of them were sent to quote unquote re-education camps to learn the proper way of being a German. So all of this is based on the fascist idea of a glorified German nation. And these groups, simply by existing in Germany, made Germany weak. And so to make Germany strong, they had to be removed. So I don't want to dwell on the Holocaust, mostly because I'm not going to be able to do it justice in a 25-minute video. But what I want to do is kind of talk about a few important signposts along the way of the Holocaust and see how it turned from a political thing into a violent thing. And then I want to take a little bit of time and think about how did we get here and think about the broader historical trends that brought us to the Holocaust. So once Hitler comes to power, the official racism begins. So all of this that we've talked about before is there, but it's not official legal policy of the German government. But now that Hitler is in charge, it becomes the official policy. So in 1933, those categories of enemies become official. In 1935, we get the Nuremberg racial laws. And I think we might have mentioned these in a previous video where we talked about the rise of Hitler. But what these Nuremberg racial laws did was they stripped away the citizenship rights of non-Germans. And to do this, they would examine family trees to look for Jewish ancestors. In a similar way to how we see the Spanish colonial system do the same thing, looking for how white your ancestors might have been and how that might affect your social status in the Spanish colonies. The idea of the Nuremberg laws was to force the non-Germans to leave. To make living in Germany so scary or distasteful that they would just leave on their own. So this is a form of self-deportation. So this is kind of the midpoint. And after this point, things become violent after this. And the violence ramps up until we get to 1942. And we get the Wannsee Conference. So the Wannsee Conference was a meeting of senior Nazi Party officials and German government officials. And the Wannsee Conference is remembered for where the final solution was approved. And when we looked at the definition of what the Holocaust was, that's what the final solution was. So this was the systematic mass murder of the Jews and other enemies of the Nazis. Most of them would be deported to occupied Poland, where they would be killed in death camps, the most infamous being Auschwitz. It's also important to note that this happened all over German occupied Europe. So, French Jews, Dutch Jews, Norwegian, any place controlled by the Germans, you would see their Jewish populations arrested and deported to death camps, most of which were in Poland and Eastern Europe. This is going to look like a statistic, and it is. The most cited number of casualties from the Holocaust is 6 million dead. It's very easy to simply write that 6 million people died. It's hard to wrap your head around that. What is important to note in here is that entire Jewish populations in Eastern Europe disappeared. There was a large Polish Jewish population before World War II. And after World War II, it had basically disappeared. The same from a lot of places in Eastern Europe. It's also important to remember that it wasn't just Jewish people who died. So while Jews were the majority, it was all of these people. It was all of these people that the Nazis thought made them weak. So all of these people died in the death camps. So it wasn't just Jewish people, it was people that did not fit the Nazi conception of what a German person was. And like I said, it's impossible to do this justice in a short video like this. There are numerous classes and courses and videos online you can watch to get more in depth into this. But what I want to turn to now is a little bit of contextualization. Why did this happen? It can seem like it came out of nowhere, but looking at trends throughout history, we can kind of see where it came from. So the next question we want to ask is, why did this happen? And the answer is that it is the culmination of a lot of different threads in European history. So, right off the bat, anti-Semitism has been around in Europe for a really long time. Essentially, as long as there have been Christians in Europe, there has been anti-Semitism in Europe. But for our purposes, this becomes very important in understanding European history during the Protestant Reformation. because Martin Luther wrote extensively about the problems Jews brought to Europe. Now, I'm not going to defend Martin Luther saying this, but Martin Luther was probably not any more anti Semitic than a regular person in Europe. He just happened to be the most famous person in Europe at the time, somebody that many, many people looked to and read the works of. And if he's saying this, then it's going to get a very large audience. And so it becomes a bigger issue because of what Martin Luther was writing about. As we move into the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, European monarchs often used Jews as scapegoats for domestic problems. And that's because Jews were easy targets. They lived separately. They looked and acted differently. So it was very easy to get people to believe that it was the Jews that started the plague. It was the Jews that caused the harvest to fail. And if we could just get rid of them, the plague will go away, the harvest will be better. And so they became easy targets. Of course, the Jews had nothing to do with those things, but in desperate times, people choose easy solutions. Finally, we need to bring in the idea of industrialization. Industrialization made this process much more efficient. So, better transportation, allowed for faster deportations. Better weapons allowed for faster killing. And so we're thinking about things like the machine gun or poison gas, things that were developed for World War I that were more or less perfected during World War II and used for maximum efficiency during the Holocaust. So the last point that I want to make here is, what do we do now? So what do we do now that we know that this was a thing? So as soon as people started learning about what was going on, the rallying cry was never again. We never want to see this happen again to another group of people, another vulnerable community like the Jews of Europe. And so, on one hand, the Holocaust focused attention on anti Semitism and the practice of ethnic cleansing. So we're very aware of these things, and that's a good thing. We should be more aware of anti Semitism, whether it's overt or unintentional. We should be aware of these things, and we need to pay attention to where ethnic cleansing is happening. But on the other hand, guilty parties are very reluctant to accept responsibility. So, for example, the United States does not consider the Trail of Tears as ethnic cleansing. Same thing for Turkey. Does not acknowledge the Armenian genocide. They accept that people died, but they won't accept them as ethnic cleansing or as a genocide. And the worst part is there have been several examples of ethnic cleansing or genocide since the Holocaust. So, for example, there were the mass killings in Cambodia in the 1970s. There were ethnic cleansings in Bosnia in the 1990s. Maybe the most famous example is the Rwandan genocide in 1994. And maybe the most egregious example of this is going on right now as we make this video. The Uyghur Muslims are being arrested and put in concentration camps in China right now. Like, as I am making this video, this is happening right now. And other than simply knowing about it, there's very little anyone is doing about it. So it's important to know about the Holocaust and want to know that we will never do this again. But given what's going on right now and what's happened after World War II and continues to happen right now, it's hard to make that claim that we're never going to let this happen again. So I'm going to stop there because this is an unresolved issue. We can't seem to figure out how to stop this from happening. So in our next set of videos, we'll talk about the start of the Cold War, which happens almost immediately after the end of World War II. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.